Well, hello, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for sticking it out. I know you're probably like hitting the nap time part of the day, so thanks for hanging around. This is an overview of our session. I'm going to do a little introduction to both our museum and myself. I'm going to go over some background context and important terminology to know when diving into this history. And then the bulk of this time is going to be this sort of thing that defied a label, which is sort of a combination of history lesson for all of you, because I don't want to assume that any of you are coming in with deep knowledge about Japanese American history in the state. I'm going to share a lot of different resources for you all to access. And then give some strategies for engaging students with learning history through using primary sources. The way that this ended up coming about was that I had this moment where I realized that a lot of the things that we have done historically as a museum have been focused on the Portland area or Hood River, and this is an Eastern Oregon workshop, and I really wanted to focus more broadly across Oregon as a whole. And so the presentation today is really sort of a representation of my own deep dive into Japanese American history across Oregon through primary sources. So I'll have some additional resources that I share at the end, and then hopefully we'll have a little smidgen for Q&A or time for exploration of stuff on your own. All right, so the mission of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, aka JAMO, is to preserve and honor the history and culture of Japanese Americans in the Pacific Northwest, educate the public about the Japanese American experience during World War II, and to advocate for the protection of civil rights for all Americans. We are located in Old Town Chinatown in downtown Portland. It is also historic Nihonmachi, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And our permanent exhibit goes through the telling of Japanese American history in Oregon from early immigration in the late 1800s through the World War II experience, and then all the way up to today. We have a second site that's about a 10-minute walk from the museum on the waterfront in Portland, which is called the Japanese American Historical Plaza. And it also tells the history of Japanese Americans in Oregon, but less literally. It is an interpretation through landscape architecture and poetry. It's very beautiful. I hope that you all, if you're in town, pop on by. I would love to see you. Alrighty. Oh, yes. We have also, when Dave set this series of presentations up, there was an intention to kind of go chronologically through time, and then unintentionally we have also gotten smaller as institutions as we've gone as well. So JAMO, we have 7 staff. Oh yeah. We have 7 staff, which is more than we've had in a very long time, and we're small but mighty, but we are operating at a different sort of scale than the other institutions that we've seen so far today. All right, me. I am a former elementary school teacher. I taught both in Portland Public Schools and in Evergreen Public Schools in Vancouver, Washington for about 12 years combined. While I was a classroom teacher, I inherited a lot of social studies curriculum that was exclusively focused on Lewis and Clark, westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, the pioneers, the Oregon Trail, which is a component of Oregon history, but ultimately kind of does this injustice by exclusion of telling any other components of what has made up the history of Oregon. So one of the things that I did as a classroom teacher was develop a unit that was about Japanese American history in Portland. And that's how I first got connected with JAMO. We had field trips to the museum every year. We had speakers from the museum every year. And they would give us feedback on the lessons that we were doing. And that relationship just sort of snowballed over time until 2022, when they were looking for a new education director. So now I'm there and I do that. And my job is sort of all-encompassing of all the things. I do tours and set up speakers. We have speakers that can meet with students in person or virtually, set up tours of the museum, do classroom visits myself to do educational activities with students, and then develop curriculum, train our docents and tour guides at the museum. And so I have kind of a many hats situation, which as a classroom teacher, we all wear many hats. All right, so that's me. Let's do some background context. If we go way back to Japan, from the early 1600s up through 1863, Japan was essentially a locked country, meaning that visitation from other places was extremely limited and heavily restricted, and then people leaving Japan to live in the West was forbidden. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the US Navy showed up and basically forced Japan to open its borders so that there could be trade between Japan and the West. He returned in 1854 and coerced the shogun of Japan at the time to sign the Peace and Amity Treaty in 1854, which sort of solidified this agreement and made it possible for people to leave Japan and resettle elsewhere. This image here is a snippet of something in our collection called the Black Ship Scroll, and it depicts Commodore Perry's arrival to Japan. This particular object has a very interesting and strange history, which you can read about on that link. So, 1854, the door becomes open for people to come to the United States from Japan at all. Another factor that plays heavily into this story is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where after decades of escalating anti-Chinese racism, the United States passed this law that effectively ended all immigration from China for about 60 years. The Library of Congress has a lesson on the Chinese Exclusion Act using a number of primary sources that is linked there. But this essentially created a gap in what I refer to as the overworked, underpaid, dangerous job market in the United States. And so these big industries began recruiting laborers from other parts of the world, including Japan. So after that point, we see this uptick in immigration from Japan. Terms to know. The first one up there is Nihonmachi. Nihon means Japan. Nihonmachi is Japantown. Portland had a Nihonmachi. These would be neighborhoods that were pretty densely populated with Japanese Americans. At one point before World War II, there were approximately 35 Nihonmachis up and down the west coast of the United States. There are very few remaining today. You could probably count them on less than one hand. The next three terms, Issei, Nisei, and Sansei, are generational terms. They match the counting system in Japanese, Ichi, Ni, San, and they continue on. But these generational terms, first generation who came to the United States from Japan, second generation, third generation, they all have some very similar experiences. And so when you encounter those terms in lessons or while you're doing reading, just know that they refer to these kind of generations of people either coming or living in the United States who have a lot of commonalities and experience. The final one is Nikkei, and you'll run into this on occasion as well. And Nikkei is people of Japanese descent who live permanently outside of the country of Japan. JAMO was formerly called the Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center, so people of Japanese descent living in Oregon. But it does not limited to the United States at all. The largest Nikkei population is actually in Brazil, in South America, which has its own interesting story. I see some faces. That happened because after Brazil outlawed the practice of slavery, they were in a similar situation where they needed a lot of laborers and did a lot of recruitment for people to come and work in the coffee fields in Brazil. Citizenship laws. Okay, so one of the things that kind of defines part of the experience of the Issei and the Nisei, those first and second generations, has to do with citizenship. So this is a very non-inclusive overview of some of the ways that naturalized citizenship and citizenship in general has changed over time. So at first, the only immigrants who could become naturalized citizens of the United States were free white people who had lived in the United States for at least 2 years. The 14th Amendment in 1868 expands citizenship to those who were born in the United States. So we then have birthright citizenship. And then in 1870, following the Civil War, naturalized citizenship is extended to formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants. 1924, Native Americans can become American citizens. And then it's not until 1952 with the McCarran-Walter Act that race is eliminated as a basis for citizenship at all. So the Issei, that first generation who come to the United States from Japan, cannot become naturalized citizens of the United States until at least 1952. The Nisei, second generation born in the United States, have birthright citizenship because of the 14th Amendment. And this really creates this unique kind of experience for each of them, those generations that come out of that. Okay, try to get my bearings here. Uh-oh, what? Okay, we got a weirdo slide. Here we go. All right, so like I said, this was sort of my own learning project. So I ended up kind of creating this experience by using the US Census to better understand Japanese American history in the United States. The US Census is a primary source document. And so I kind of got curious about this by looking at this map that I encountered. This is a map that was created by the Wartime Civil Control Administration in 1940 that maps geographically where populations of Japanese Americans were in the state. So each of the dots on the map represent 10 people of Japanese descent and where they were in the state at the time. And there's a link to that map if you are ever curious about it. But this map got me thinking about, well, what did that look like over time? And so I went into the census and I pulled the census reports between 1880 and 1950. And found all of the population numbers by decade for the Japanese population by county. And here's my first tip. The census is horrible to look at. There is a lot of numbers, a lot of data, a lot of information, and it's extremely overwhelming to look at in this format. So my first tip is that if you're using something like this with students, make it visual, because this is not easily accessible. However, students can help you make those visuals. What I did is not complicated at all. So using these census reports, I made maps by county in Oregon each decade from 1880 to 1950 in the very same way, which brings me to my second tip for using data like this with students, which is, or actually not just data, but building timelines or creating progressions of images or maps can be in a very effective way for students to be able to access patterns, change over time, and the way that things are shifting and trends that are happening. So have your students do the work for you. In 1880, there were no counties in Oregon that had more than 10 people of Japanese descent living in them. So my maps start at 1890. And just like in the original WCCA map, for me, my dots, my red dots, each dot represents 10 people of Japanese descent. Also important to note, I rounded up from 8. So if a county had 8, I give them a dot. If they had 28, I give them 3 dots. And then the census data that I was using is by county. It does not refer, I mean, I could have gone into each county's census data, but I did not do that. So where my dots are may not be exactly geographically correct. I did use that 1940 map as a general guide of where people were, but it may not be perfect. And the learning that comes out of it, I think, ends up being relatively the same regardless of where exactly people were. So I'm going to flip through these. Some of you may be flipping through them already right now because you're curious. But I'm going to flip through the first few of these. And as I go, I want you to just look at them and think about what you notice and what you wonder about them. Here we go. Here's 1900. Hold on to them. 1910. 1920. 1930. My dots get smaller because I got tired of making dots with my little red pen. And 1940. All right. Uh-oh, there's that missing slide. All right, if we go back here. What did you notice? What did you wonder? Have a conversation with the people around you for a couple minutes. Can I hear from a few people? What did you notice? Quick hand in the back.
So I know you was a county, teaching more county. It looks like county kind of stayed consistent. It started off and had like 10, dropped to 4 pretty quickly, and kind of stayed there.
Yeah.
Warwick County had 10 in like 1890 and then nothing.
Yeah.
It was kind of a weird.
Just talking about that. There's a good story down here that you should hear. What else?
In 03. In the flood, yeah, he saved like 4 or 5 people.
Wow.
And he is buried in Earth.
That's cool.
Based on a cemetery.
That's cool.
When he should.
Yeah.
I was looking at Muller County and how 1910 they had a solid population, but then it decreased and then it jumps to the 1940s. I Googled it, but I don't know if that's this way.
Probably not, but good work. This is the whole point, inquiry, getting curious about stuff. Yes?
One of the things that's interesting, I was on an archaeological dig a couple summers ago at...
I'm gonna talk about it.
and it's funny because I grew up in the area and there's a meadow called Japanese Meadow and never put the together and Chelsea Rose that was on the slide, so we looked yeah. And it's really interesting, like even what we've had here and when they went, and then we even had a camp that was later back after internment, was moved back to Grand.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, any questions that came up as you were looking that you didn't know the answers to?
I really lost the mention.
Oh, well, we'll get there.
My question was, why did they, it seems like they just moved to the northwest portion of the state.
Yeah, why?
of the state.
Yeah. One thing that I've talked about with other folks at the museum is that a lot of those jobs that people were initially recruited for were those high intensity jobs, manual labor, heavy manual labor, and they're kind of young people's work. And then as people got older and maybe kind of had enough money or was ready to do something else, people may have moved back into kind of those urban centers to settle down.
I'm
Yes.
just gonna add that I think I've done research on Chinese and where they lived in Oregon, and it's a very similar pattern of like they're living in eastern and southern Oregon because of mining and railroads, and then they stop. And it is also very similar to sort of like the pattern of any, or like overall in America, moving from rural areas into urban areas. So it maybe is a little bit ahead of that, but there's some of that happening too, just like in general, people are moving into cities for jobs.
Yeah. Fabulous. What did you learn about Pollard?
Oh, I learned that
Because I don't know it.
that there was a work camp up there, and that people were taken from Multnomah area and sent to Muller for.
We will talk about that. Yes. All right. So we get up to 1940. And as many of you noticed, we have this sort of like concentration happening away from rural areas into these more urban areas. The counties at this point that had the largest populations of Japanese Americans were Multnomah County, where Portland is, and Hood River County. And so if you were curious about what's going on in those places, or if you wanted to teach your students about the Japanese American history in those places, here's some things that you could use. First thing, our museum developed a story map in conjunction with the Architectural Heritage Center. And if I go to our website, I can show you the real thing. Here's our website. If you hover over the education tab, a lot of things come up. Some of these may be helpful to you, the educators part. But the first thing underneath the tab is the story map. And then if you open the story map, it looks like this. So this is, I don't know if you can see it up there, but the scroll bar over here is real little. This is a gigantic scrollable document. And it goes through 20 selected sites. They're both like places and people in Portland's Japanese American community that have been important over time. This selection of 20 sites has been broken up into 3 categories. So we have the growth of a community, which really highlights the earlier days, or like the development of the neighborhood of Nihonmachi. We have meeting new challenges, which touches briefly on kind of the lead up to World War II incarceration. And then we have a legacy that endures that really focuses on the post-war up to today years. One thing that I really like about this story map is that incarceration is not the focus. It really tries to tell the stories of the people and places of Portland's history. Andrew was talking about kind of humanizing people, and I think a great disservice that often happens with teaching Japanese American history is you only hear the story of incarceration and nothing else. And that does such a great disservice to what came before and what came after. And so this really tries to focus on that piece, on what came before and what happened afterward. One way that I have used this with students is to break all of this text into those 3 categories and assign a third of the class to read each one, and then do a jigsaw with some sort of prompt. This year I did it with the History Day prompt of turning points. So they each read their section thinking about turning points in history, and then got together to discuss what turning points they noticed, because there's ones that are going to be super obvious, and then ones that are going to be less obvious. For example, Dr. Lister is mentioned in this story map, and I feel like the understanding of hygiene practices in medicine is certainly a turning point in history. The first thing up here is this kind of slider bar map. This is a before and after of those 20 sites that are highlighted. This is certainly not representative of all of the Japanese American sites in Portland. You can also zoom in and out. So if we slide to the right, this would be pre-war, and if we slide to the left, this is today. And each of these sections kind of follow the same pattern. So it'll tell you the name of the place or the person, show you where that is on the map of Portland, and then that follows with several paragraphs of text about that place or person, along with articles, maps, images, so on and so forth. All of those can be expanded and used that way. There are also little info tabs up at the top that can give you some additional information. For ones that have articles, the image will not be the article in its entirety, but you will always have the option to download the article in full if you would like to use that with students. So this can be great to use with students, or it can be a great sort of personal learning if that's something that you are curious about learning more about. Buttons, okay. All right, so that's the story map. The next 2 things I have are lesson plans that will be on our website soon. They are not there yet, but they should be hopefully within a month. The first one is a lesson plan that was developed about Portland's Japantown. It was written by a 3rd grade teacher in Portland, and it is aimed for 3rd through 8th grade students, and it engages students in developing an understanding of the Japanese American community in Portland through examining images, text, videos, music, and more. It's really solid, and I think it's going to be a solid resource that we'll have. The other unit that will be on our website soon is about the Hood River incident. Are any of you familiar with the Hood River incident? I see a couple of nods. Yeah, so the Hood River incident is when the American Post Legion 22 in Hood River voted to remove the names of 16 Nisei soldiers from the public bulletin board listing all service members from Hood River County in 1944. And they received a lot of letters in response to that decision. They were replaced on the sign about 6 weeks later, I think. But this lesson plan has students kind of build a timeline of events connected to that goes all the way up to 2022. So it's one of those things that history is not as far back in the past as it may feel. Okay, so that gets us those 2 kind of major hubs within Oregon, Portland and Hood River. But there's a lot of Oregon left. So what's going on in the rest of the state? Let's go back to our favorite friend, the census. So if you pull up the census, one of the things that will be in there is a gigantic chart that lists all of the common jobs at the time and the percentages of how many people were doing those jobs. One thing to point out, this is not exclusive to people of Japanese descent. This is statewide, anyone who's working, I think over the age of 14. But some interesting things pan out, which are accurate also for the Japanese American community. So we have things that would have been happening in kind of urban or industrial places, wholesale and retail trade, personal services, so this is like hotels and laundry, and then professional services. Those would all be happening in city centers like downtown Portland or possibly downtown Hood River. But then all of these other jobs with green arrows that pop up as having larger percentages, these are largely rural jobs outside of these kind of city centers. And the things that pop up are also super common jobs that Japanese Americans were doing at the time. So farming, by 1923, something like 60% of the Japanese population in Oregon was involved in agriculture and experiencing major success doing so. This was mostly east of Oregon, Gresham, Troutdale, Hood River, Montevilla. Yes?
Perspective, bringing immigrants in, they produce steady production of the balanced products.
Yeah, exactly. For the Japanese American farmers who were working in these counties or these areas, they were producing somewhere between 30 and 90% of the produce that was coming out of those areas. Vegetables, strawberries, raspberries, loganberries, very successful. And of course, one of the things that comes with that is pushback from the majority, right? So we have new laws that go into effect, like the Alien Land Law that prohibits people ineligible from citizenship from owning or leasing land, which is a direct attempt by white farmers and granges and politicians to limit the success of Japanese American farmers. We had farming happening in the Lake LaBiche area near Salem, which matches up with this little piece of the map there. So this is a man named Roy Fukuda. He was known as the Celery King. He was one of the first, I think maybe the first, Japanese American who settled in the Lake LaBiche area. Lake LaBiche had been drained in the 1850s, and he worked really hard to kind of convert his land into kind of from beaver marshes into arable farmland. He originally tried to grow hops and ultimately decided that the land was better suited to celery. He developed a strain of celery called Golden Plume, which was kind of, I don't know, countrywide renowned for its superior flavor. President Calvin Coolidge was known to have liked it. And Roy Fukuda kind of led the organization of the LaBiche Meadows Celery Union for other Japanese American celery farmers in the area. In 1925, the LaBiche Meadows Celery Union shipped 314 freight cars of celery, and most of that was going to the East Coast, to the Eastern market. Yeah. All right. If you were watching this Clatsop County situation, we have this kind of like explosion that happens over time. And this correlates directly to the salmon canneries that are happening. This is a little excerpt of this very, very large map, which is linked there. But the salmon canneries kind of came into being around World War I and remained super popular in the 20s and 30s. And then as the salmon population declined, the canneries also declined. But in 1909, I believe, there were like 500 Japanese laborers who were sent to work in the canneries from Portland. What was I going to say? Oh, this also, as Emily had mentioned, really correlates with this shift in population with the Chinese laborers and then the Chinese Exclusion Act and this gap in the market. And then we have Japanese laborers coming in to fill that. Lumber was another major industry. The lumber industry was booming at the time, and people were needed to come and cut down trees to build so that people could do construction projects and build new buildings and things. And the Japanese Americans were often hired at lower rates of pay than their white counterparts for these jobs, and also assigned the tasks that their white counterparts found the least interesting or the most boring. They would have worked pretty strenuous hours, 10 to 14 hours a day, and ended up living kind of in tent sites away from the rest of the workers. But the lumber produced would have been kind of prepared for market in sawmills like this one. This one's in the Cascade Mountains in 1910. And places like this would have had to transport their lumber to market. And then the question is, well, how does it get there? By train. At this point, highway systems had not been completed in the state. There would have been roads kind of in some, between some major cities, but you wouldn't have been able to drive from Portland to La Grande the way that I did just yesterday. Yeah, so the railroads. I think a lot of people think about Chinese laborers being responsible for the Transcontinental Railroad, which is absolutely accurate. And then after that Chinese Exclusion Act, much of the labor that was being done was often done by Japanese American workers. These were extremely physically demanding jobs, but often paid kind of twice of what farming jobs would. So sometimes people saw it as a way that you could kind of go out and work for a few years and make some better money before maybe settling in a city center. An interesting thing that I was thinking about while I was doing this is the correlation between where those railroads ended up and where people ended up. So it might be a little bit hard to see, but these black lines on the map are just two of the railroads that were established in Oregon at the time. But where they are located pretty directly correlates with where people of Japanese descent were living at the time. And we already heard about Homer Yasui. He's going to talk to us now. JAMO has a collection of oral histories. All of our oral histories are housed at Densho. And I'll talk a little bit more about Densho later. But Densho is a fantastic resource that has just a wealth of information to access, including a lot of primary sources. So this is Homer, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his dad and what his dad was doing when he first came to the U.S. He meanders a little bit, but he's an excellent storyteller. And the story is that his dad settled in Hood River because he thought that Mount Hood looked so much like Mount Fuji.
But Portland was a huge port of entry for the Japanese. One of the reasons for that, around 1900, the railroad business is going great guns. And the reason why it's going great guns is because the Chinese laborers were excluded. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but that was enacted in 1882, and it said that no Chinese laborers are allowed in the United States anymore. And every 10 years thereafter, they renewed that. So they excluded them from 1882, and that immediately stopped the tens of thousands of Chinese laborers, mainly the railroad workers, from coming to the United States. Those who were already here could stay on, but over the years they're getting older. So about 18, 20 years later, in the 1900s, the labor force was getting too old, and they were dying off, and they're going back to China and so on. So the railroad magnates, the big shots, Jim Hill and Leland Stanford, Huntington, they hired Japanese laborers to come over, and that's when the immigration really took off for the Japanese in Oregon. In Hawaii, it was earlier. In California, a little earlier. But in Oregon, it started around 1900. Specifically, for example, my grandpa, Shinataro Yasui, came with his two boys, this is my uncle, Taitsuro and Renji, in 1898. So my grandpa, I never really knew my grandpa, but he came with his two boys. These two boys are my father's a little bit older brother, and they worked on the railroad in Eastern Oregon for about 2 or 3 or 4 years. And then they went back to Japan in 1902. And then I told you earlier on another story that my uncle got married in 1904. But my father came here in 1903, and because he knew that one of his brothers, that's my uncle Taitsuro, had stayed in the United States. Instead of going back with my grandpa Shinataro and my uncle Renichi, my uncle Taitsuro stayed in the United States, and he was working out of Pocatello, Idaho, which was a big railroad hub in that day. In those days, this is in the 1900s, there were thousands of Japanese working in the railroads here. At one time, it was reported there were 13,000 Issei laborers working on the railroads in the Pacific Northwest. And in order to recruit these young men, there were these labor contracting companies. And one of them was Shinzaburo Ban, which was stationed in Portland. The other one you may have heard of was the Teikoku Company. This is the Matsushima family. And they also recruited laborers. And I don't know which of the organization recruited my father, but he also worked on the railroad, and he started out in the little town of Turner, which is a little bit south of Salem. And this is 1903, and then eventually he worked on the railroad in Montana and in Idaho. But he was too small and the work was so hard. It was very, very difficult work. So eventually he said, hey, this is not for me. I came to the United States to learn English, and I'm going to do that. So he quit the railroad and he came to Portland, and he studied English at the old Cooch Street School, which doesn't exist anymore. And then he took a job as a houseboy, which is a very, very common thing in those days. Then from that year on, my father had decided, he determined after a couple of years here that he's going to stay forever in the United States, because even though there was discrimination and things were tough, it was worse in Japan, because here in the United States, here in Oregon, they could make almost 10 times as much money as they could back in Japan. For him, it was probably the decision was relatively easy because he was the youngest son. There was only 3 boys in his family, but the oldest son in traditional Japanese fashion, they stay home to take care of the property and the families, the fathers and mothers. So Taitsuro, my oldest uncle, did go back, and he did exactly do that. But my uncle Renichi, the middle uncle on my father, stayed in the United States for the rest of their lives. They went to Japan for visits, but they came, well, my uncle Renichi came in 1898, went back to Japan, and then came back to the United States. My father came in 1903, and they stayed. So it was the railroad boom and logging and canning in the Oregon territories that drew so many of the Issei.
Homer is a great storyteller. He is always fun to listen to. He just passed last summer. He was 97 or 98. And we're so thankful that we have his stories recorded in the oral history repository. So as we've already heard, oral histories can be a really great way to connect students directly with people who have experienced these things or get insider input. Somebody brought this up earlier, but another thing that's been underway very recently is this archaeological dig in John Day at the site of a former sawmill. And the things that they are uncovering there are things like delicate gold ring and children's toys and fine china plates and things that kind of hint at the fact that for some of these remote rural jobs that people were doing, it may not have been young single men exclusively on their own, but that some people may have been kind of having their family with them along on the road. So the full article is linked there if you'd like to read more about it. Okay, somebody was like, okay, but I want to know about 1950. So let's get back to that. We're going to pick up where we left off. Here's 1940. And then this time, when I jump to 1950, I want you to think about what you already know in addition to what you notice and what you wonder. Here's 1950. And this time, because you've been sitting for a minute, get up, find somebody you haven't talked to yet today, and tell them what you notice and what you wonder and what you already know. Go. All right. Well, what do you already know happened between 1940 and 1950 that kind of goes to explain it? World War II. Yes. Great. What else did you notice? What else did you wonder about while looking? There was a lot of conversation going on and a lot of pointing. So I'm sure there were some rich conversations being had. What was happening?
I actually know, like, why the southeastern Oregon, like, do you want me to talk about it?
We'll talk about it,
Okay.
but yes, please feel free to add on to it when we get to that part.
Okay.
Yes. But yes, we have this big shift out of that Multnomah County area and into rural Malheur County. Yeah. What else?
I think it just shows that people weren't coming back.
Yeah.
They were choosing to not go back to where they were living pre-World War II, after World War II.
I saw another. Yeah.
She was bringing it up, and she's looking at something else. So, we were noticing that in Lake County, there's like a consistent dot or two dots there for a long time until 1950 when it's gone.
Yeah.
So it's there, and it's just gone.
Yep.
1950. So like either they, like the families died off, or they moved, or something. It's kind of interesting that one dot in Lake County just is gone.
My working theory, so one thing that's not on that railroad map is that there is a rail line that goes here. So my working theory is that there were people who were working on the railroad and just kind of stayed there. So this was connecting to a line in California. And a sawmill, yeah. Often, yes, a lot of those things kind of all overlapped and jumbled. But yeah, it is really interesting to look at this, this shift. Post-incarceration, about 70% of Oregon's population of Japanese Americans returned to the state of Oregon. But if you look at the breakdown for what that really looks like geographically, it doesn't quite match up. You know, it's not like 70% of what had been here is the same. And so it doesn't quite fit. And we do get this great decrease in Western Oregon and this great increase in Eastern Oregon during this time period. Important to note that there was an active government program encouraging people to resettle outside of the exclusion zone. So people were actively encouraged not to return to where they had lived prior to World War II, which does explain some of that. If you are interested in teaching your students about World War II incarceration, some great resources to do that are this film. This is a film that was made by the National Park site at Minidoka, and it's about 30 minutes long. It's extremely powerful. I would say it's definitely maybe upper middle and high school appropriate, or for your own research. And then there were educational materials developed that kind of correspond to that through here. And these lessons all have a short clip of the film along with some activities that go along with it. And there's 4 of them that highlight on these different themes: patriotism and protest, the power of words, the power of the press, and standing up for others. and I find them to be really powerful. They do have, I think they were written for 6th through 12th grade, but as a former elementary school teacher, I know that I became very adept at adapting things for younger students. There are a lot of great strategies in that curriculum for integrating primary source material into the learning. Another thing that's important to note when you're studying this time period with students is that following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there were a number of things that Japanese Americans were not allowed to own, including cameras. So there's a period of several years where all of the photo documentation that we have of this experience was either photos taken by the government or photos that were taken by newspaper and other like media sources. And that can be a great inlet to use with students in looking at these in a more critical way. This is a photo that was taken by the government of a Minidoka High School history class. What's it look like there? How would you describe it? Clean. Clean. Orderly. Orderly. Staged. Yeah.
Studious, focused.
Studious. It sure looks staged. Yeah. And then you can compare that. So the way that we can get kind of that own voice representation to kind of compare with these images is through artwork, oral histories, diaries, things like that, where we're getting a look at what things were actually like for people. So this is an excerpt from an oral history from a guy named Sugo Aketa. He was a high school student at the time. And he says, I remember one classroom, the English teacher was talking about democracy, and we really booed her because we weren't being treated like persons who lived in a democracy. Well, I think deep down, we felt embittered. So when she was putting up this farce that this was a democracy, it was just too much. And it was a spontaneous reaction. It's an unusual reaction when Niseis do at that time to be saying such a negative thing back to the teacher, which usually we respected. But I know that after that, she never raised that issue of democracy, of a democratic country or democratic values. So putting those two things side by side, have a conversation with a neighbor about how comparing those two primary sources may give students a kind of different perspective on this experience. What came up for you all? How might you use this? Why might this be helpful or important? Thoughts, ideas?
For those of us living in the river area, this is directly older. They have sweet berries, but they're still resident.
Yeah, the Aketas, he's from also Hood River. Yeah, his cousin, Grant, I don't know, a relation is a docent at the museum. Yeah, yeah.
You can also use this to kind of tie together with understanding the importance of almost fact checking, because like what you see isn't necessarily the truth.
Yeah.
So that could apply to today too. And
Yeah.
so we could use this and then say, okay, let's look at this picture from today. What do you see? What do you think is actually going on? We were having a conversation about like, if that picture was posted in a newspaper or whatever, like, would people back then question what was going on? Because it really wasn't until Watergate that actually started being a thing where we started to question what was in the newspapers, what was in, or what's going on from our government. So it's kind of, it's interesting, like if, what they would have thought.
Yeah, there was very little resistance from the broader public to the forced removal of Japanese Americans. And some of what I think about that has to do with what information people had access to. Because, if all they're consuming is what's publicly available in the newspaper or on the radio that the government is putting out, there's very intentional messaging that they are trying to put out there, that this is the right decision, that everything's going smoothly, everyone is fine, this is what's good for the country and good for everyone involved. And so, really setting up your students for success and being kind of critical consumers of information is super important life skill that I feel like in the age of social media is even more important and easier to not do. So, yes. I do want to make another note about language. This is just copied from our website about terminology. So the language that's used to describe Japanese American history has shifted over time. And JAMO uses the language on the right-hand side and does not, tries to avoid using the language on the left-hand side. One that's super common is the distinction between internment and incarceration. So we use the term incarceration to describe what happened during World War II, and that's because internment is a word that has a meaning that does not match what happened in the United States. Internment, the definition of that word has to do with detaining foreign nationals, enemy nationals in a time of war. 2/3 of the people who were forcibly removed and incarcerated during World War II were Nisei or Sansei. They were American citizens by birthright. So that shift has been a very intentional one to move away from a word that does not always match with what the experience was. The other ones that are there, some important ones that you may hear me mention are forced removal instead of evacuation. We have used that to kind of move away from the natural disaster kind of connotation that evacuation has. This was not a natural disaster. This was a decision to forcibly remove people from where they had lived and imprison them. The other one is internment camp, or sometimes relocation center, and sometimes that is now called American concentration camp or incarceration camp. I think another important piece of this conversation is that sometimes people's feathers get ruffled when they hear that term concentration camp in this context. However, it is important to point out that there has been kind of an ongoing shift away from euphemistic language across the board. And so a lot of times the camps that we think of historically being concentration camps in Europe are now being called death camps or extermination camps, because the definition, again, more naturally fits with this experience. Any questions about that part?
Yeah, just the thing too, not, besides campus food, that they're not allowed.
Yeah, if you look up Proclamation number 3 from World War II, it'll list them all, but it's like radios, weapons, munitions, cameras.
So literally anything that you shut down your ability to defend yourself, shut down your ability to contact anybody, and shut down your ability to listen to anybody.
Yeah.
Which would have been a violation of the Geneva Convention if it would have been combatant in the war.
Yeah, and it's one of those that, the justification was, the stereotype was that all Japanese Americans are definitely going to be allied with Japan and work together with Japan to attack the United States in some way, shape, or form. And so we need to take away their access to things that they can use to either spy on or attack the United States. But yes, the flip side of that is that you are then removing people's access to the things that would allow them to experience the world in a different way. All right. Okay, let's talk about this. And some of you may know a lot more than I do about this, but chime in if you need to. So We talked a little bit about the reduction that happens in Western Oregon, but let's dig into what's going on in Eastern Oregon. The short answer is sugar beets. During the war, there was a massive sugar shortage, a massive need for the large-scale production of sugar beets. The sugar was converted into industrial alcohol and used in the production of munitions and synthetic rubber. And most of the labor force that had been working on these farms was now away at war. And so there were many thousands of acres of planted sugar beets that were on the line to be lost altogether if the government could not find a labor force to kind of fill in. So this conversation about this labor shortage and need for sugar overlapped with the planning of the forced removal of Japanese Americans. And the executive secretary of the Oregon governor at the time, in a meeting, had this bright idea, what if we use these 4,000 incarcerated Japanese Americans as a farm labor, like agricultural labor source? This became known as the Oregon Plan. And although the Oregon Plan eventually did not pan out the way that it was initially intended to, it did lead to the development of a farm labor camp in Malheur County called Nissa. And there were several others. Adrian was another one. But Japanese Americans had the opportunity to volunteer to leave the temporary detention centers where they were kept while the government was building the 10 more permanent camps in the interior. And they were able to voluntarily leave to work on these farm labor camps. Nissa was kind of the test model, and then they were replicated in other places as well. But these were, people chose this for a multitude of options, including people wanted to do something actively to support the war effort. And this was a way that they could do that. This was a way that they could also avoid being incarcerated behind barbed wire. There was more freedom in these farm labor camps. There was no armed guards. There was no barbed wire. The living conditions were not ideal, but it was an option. They also got paid significantly more. They got paid the going rate for the work that they did on these farm labor camps, which was significantly more than they would have been paid had they been transferred to Minidoka or Heart Mountain or Tule Lake. I'll talk about it on the next slide, but this is the National Archives World War II propaganda posters. There's a lot to look at. And then Uprooted, which I'll talk a little bit more about, really focuses on the history of Japanese American farm labor. This is the first, well, it's not the first, but it's the first one that's in the digital collection of the Evacuzette. This was the newspaper that incarcerees at the Portland Temporary Detention Center started to publish. And the first one that they have available on Densho talks about how 250 people were leaving, volunteering to head out to go and work in the beet fields. There are a lot of, in the very beginning, Dave was talking about the FSA and the photographers that were hired to go out and document the Dust Bowl and the Depression. Photographers were also hired to document the Japanese American incarceration experience. So Russell Lee took a lot of photos of Nissa and Adrian and the farm labor in Eastern Oregon. The Library of Congress has a collection of his photos connected to that. And the Uprooted exhibit that's linked on the last slide, that website has not been super, I don't think anybody's in charge of it, and it's been a little bit abandoned, but there's a lot of good stuff on there. They have a lot of documents that are connected to the Oregon Plan and the farm labor in Eastern Oregon, as well as there's a slideshow. The lesson plan is gone, but the slideshow is still there that compiles a selection of Russell Lee's photos of Japanese American farm labor and a selection of photos taken by Japanese Americans of their experience doing farm labor. And it's that same sort of contrast between government photos and own voice photos that's very worth investigating. I also wanted to point out, I know we have K-5 folks here. This is an Alan Say book called Music for Alice. It follows the story of Alice Sumida. Her family chose to go work in the beet fields in Eastern Oregon and ended up owning the largest gladiola bulb farm in the United States. Kind of an interesting story, but a great picture book, and it can be a nice kind of entry point into this history for younger students. Where am I? Who knows? Did I miss anything about sugar beet farming in Malheur County? Yes.
So they also harvested potatoes. It wasn't exclusively sugar beet. And then there was also a camp, work camp in Hartford, Oregon, and they harvested potatoes.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes.
On the Secretary of State, the Oregon Secretary of State's page, there's an interesting primary source, because if you're thinking about whether Southeastern Oregon really welcomed their labor, and there's a letter from a bank manager in Ontario complaining to that governor, saying when they come into town, they take over, and it's just a really weird, dichotomy of they're supposed to be helping the war effort, but people are still not welcoming. Because you see the pictures in front of the ice cream, having ice cream, or in front of the Nissa movie theater. Is anybody from Nissa? Is there still a movie theater there? It's interesting to think about, but everyone looks happy, but they're still not really welcome.
Another interesting piece of that is that the exclusion zone kind of bisected Oregon. So for the Japanese Americans who lived east of that evacuation zone or the exclusion zone after or before the beginning of the United States being involved in World War II, they didn't have to go anywhere, and they were free. And then they have people who are being forced to work there who had lived in the Portland area or the Willamette Valley or Hood River, who are in a very different situation than they were. Yeah. I went ahead and pulled the census data from the year 2000, because why not? And mapped it. It's important to note that this is only one race only, people of Japanese descent. So this does not even encompass biracial or multiracial people who have Japanese descent as well. But I think a thing that has become really clear to me, the more and more that I have learned about history, and I talked about this with a neighbor earlier, was about how the way things are now is never random. There is always some explanation and some connection to the past that kind of sets things up for the way that they are now. And so, we still see that heavy population in Multnomah County and through the Willamette Valley. And then I pulled this excerpt from the Oregon Encyclopedia that says, in 2000, 85% of those with Japanese ancestry in Oregon lived in just 8 counties: Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, Lane, Marion, Jackson, Benton, and Malheur. The population of Malheur County is distinctive, having the highest percentage of Japanese Americans, which is still less than 2% of its total population, and among those, the lowest percent who are biracial at 16%. So it's not an accident. It's not an accident that people end up where they are, and it is heavily connected to this history and legacy of Japanese American immigration, settling, incarceration, and resettling. I'm almost at the end. This is my resources slide. This is a direct link to the digital story map. This is our curriculum resources page, which has nothing on it right now, but will shortly. This you have in your folder, but I like to put the link to it because sometimes on a whim I'll add or change something. So this is the live link plus all the things that are on there. Some of them have links, so you can click on them from here. Helpful to do. What else? Densho, I mentioned Densho, and I want to highlight that here. Densho is based out of Seattle, but they are like a digital entity only. And their mission is to preserve and educate about Nikkei history in the United States. And they have an absolutely expansive collection of oral histories, images, documents, all kinds of things. They have searchable, and then for all of the oral histories, they have them fully transcripted. And so you can go in and do a Control F search if there's something specific that you're looking for information about in an oral history, which I use all the time. Yeah, so there's a ton in here. I'm not going to go over it all. I do recommend this article in the Oregon Historical Quarterly from Barbara Yasui, relative of Min and Homer. And I'm sorry, but if you have a public library card, you can often access JSTOR for free, and JSTOR has the Oregon Historical Quarterly articles available there.
It has all, I believe, all OHQ articles.
I'm sorry. I also put a link to our collections, which is significantly less well organized than the Oregon Historical Society's, but it does have images, documents, objects, et cetera, that you can look for there. And then if you are interested in dorking out on census stuff, I included all of the census data that I used, plus the page that information is on. And I included the blank Oregon County maps by year. If you want to learn more about farm labor for Japanese Americans, this is an online conference that happened a while back that you can have access to. And this presentation that's linked was done by Morgan Young, who did most of the research for the Uprooted exhibit that's online. So that's that. And that brings me to the end.